So as we have seen from the economic dimension of globalization, globalization is also being driven forward by the integration of the world economy, as Giddens said. In addition to that, you also have what is called the electronic economy, another factor that underpins economic globalization, where banks, corporations, fund managers, and individual investors are able to shift their funds internationally just by clicking a mouse. So moving on from the economic dimension of globalization, we now cover the political dimension. As Watters mentioned, there are three dimensions of globalization: economic, political, and cultural. So the first key debate here is whether globalization has weakened the state. So according to Kenichi Omae, all that the state is able to do right now is to ensure its economy is open to trade and investment. And Omae says that the role of governments in individual nation states has changed. In truly global markets, the key success factor has shifted from resources to the marketplace, and companies need to participate in them to prosper. That means that people are the only true means of creating wealth, and that nation states' government's role is to ensure stable access to best and the cheapest goods and services from anywhere in the world. And then we have the economists, or the skeptics, Hurst and Thompson, who talk about how the regulation of the international economy is possible if the major countries choose to coordinate their policies. And their main point is that trade and investment flows were actually higher between 1890 to 1914 than at present. So they talk about the era before World War I. And globalization has been largely confined to the major OECD member countries. Meanwhile, Susan Strange introduces some other factors, saying that states are dependent on the private sector. And her main point is that big businesses, drug barons, insurers, accountants, and international bureaucrats all to some extent interfere with nation states. Another political scientist, David Held, says that states are increasingly constrained by international norms and conventions concerning democracy and human rights. And his main point is that globalization has been happening in the past, although today, at present, it affects more human activities more intensely. And then Michael Mann says that little evidence exists that nation states have either been weakened or strengthened. And Michael Mann talks about the uneven reach of globalization and interactions between nation states. While Linda Weiss talks about how globalization has an enabling as well as restricting effect on the state's own regulatory capacities. So she thinks that globalization and its definitions are problematic because it could actually strengthen the state rather than undermine it. So that kind of contradicts the whole concept of globalization. In terms of the new forms of the state, Jessica Matthews believes that there has been a redistribution of power away from nation states, and that resources and balances of power have been rearranged and are no longer constrained by nation states' boundaries, as we talk about the Westphalian system. And of course, going back to Sclair, he talks about the existence of a powerful elite globally called the transnational capitalist class. And they, of course, are responsible for creating and sustaining the system that continues to generate profit and continues to feed this entire transnational capitalism. And finally, we come to the final dimension of globalization, which is cultural globalization. So the key debate here is whether globalization has led to cultural homogenization across the world. So you have Barber, who talks about the Mac world, and what Barber means by this is the spread of consumer goods, especially from the US across the world, will lead towards the creation of something called the Mac world, which is a homogenized global culture. He believes that, just like in McDonald's or in fast food, everything becomes standardized. And then, of course, Claire, who appears in all three dimensions, talk about the culture ideology of consumerism, which is basically the ideology sustained by the transnational capitalist class to support the system of transnational capitalism. So Claire conducted a Marxist analysis of the spread of Western consumerism, believing that the transnational capitalist class drives the expansion of global trade and production, and to stimulate consumer demand, that's where they promote this culture ideology of consumerism, usually through soap operas and shopping malls, where a lot of advertising is, visible. But you also have people like Ulf Hannes, who rejects the idea that there is a Western consumer culture being imposed on the rest of the world, because for Hannes this is too simplistic, and that cultural influence is a highly complex and differentiated phenomenon, where some countries have more influence on a specific cultural practice than others. When cultural practices do travel from the developing world, it's not necessarily through the mass media, and people don't just accept it uncritically, but sometimes they produce new hybrid forms, like you have hipster food, people taking something like McDonald's and then combining it with maybe durian or something local and generating their own new hybrid product. And of course, you have the nationalism theorist Anthony Smith, who believes that most of us will continue to identify with the nation and will continue to do so in the future, and that the potential for a global culture is weak because there is no history it can build on. Because national cultures develop from pre-modern traditions, and the success of nationalist movements depends on appealing to long-held and deeply rooted popular traditions. Popular opinion is strongly wedded to these traditions because they provide us with a link to past and future generations. Nations need a plausible account of their own development because they need to convince us that we are part of a larger entity that has endured and will endure. However, a global culture has no such history to draw upon. So Anthony Smith doesn't totally believe that globalization will challenge the integrity of the nation-state. However, it is necessary to mention several new trends that perhaps represent a challenge to both globalization and to sociology in general. So according to research by Matthew Mann and Huppets in a paper called A Sociology of COVID-19 in 2020, they mentioned that the seemingly impossible has happened. Borders have closed, nations have locked down, and individuals have socially isolated for the collective good. In another paper by Sulkowski, 2020 also, who talks about the COVID-19 pandemic, finds that the economies of individual countries are entering a phase of stagnation and recession that will probably lead to a global recession. So Sulkowski calls this a possible deglobalization and mentions that national governments are indeed the dominant actors in coordinating epidemic activities to deal with coronavirus. Because according to the journal One Health in 2020, although humanity has survived previous pandemics by infectious agents, the present one is unprecedented in its capacity to take advantage of modern globalization, allowing for massive transborder spread at a surprising speed. So this may imply a return to the importance of the nation-state.